There is a vastness in the void between stars that is soft as a blanket when you do not think of it as infinite. It breathes in slow cycles, a galaxy-wide inhalation, a galaxy-wide exhalation, and those who live beneath its dark ribs learn to time their own breathing to it. The Ultramarines know this rhythm as well as they know the angle of their bayonets. They learned it in the hush of barracks, beneath the cathedral light of recruitment halls, under banners that sway even when there is no wind. Let that image sit for a moment. Banners quiet, the faint mechanical whispering of men and machines aligning to one another. Imagine the hull of a battle barge, enormous and patient, resting like an island in a black sea. Imagine corridors lit by a gentle, blue-white light, not harsh but measured, a light that seems to be breathed out by the ship itself. There is always a sound here, the slow hum of the reactor, the almost human creak of bulkheads holding centuries of silence. Your hand, if you placed it against the hull, would feel cold metal, and beneath that, a warmth that comes from the living things who call this place home. The sound of machinery is close and comforting. Servos sighing, cogwheels whispering, the far-off tap of a hammer. It is not an industrial noise. It is a lullaby translated into engineering. In a small, private alcove, the kind of narrow sanctum that smells faintly of oil and incense, a figure sits and prays, not with the fever of the zealot, not with the rattled voice of madness, but with a tired ritualism that is almost parental. This figure is tall. His armor, when we see it, appears like calm ocean, matte blue with brass trim and the symbol of a spear and laurel across the breastplate. He keeps his helm unclipped, resting on a table, and in the small space between metal and flesh, you might have imagined you could still find a man. His name, once, belonged to a family on a green world, but that name has been pressed into the shape of duty and become as much armor as the plates on his shoulders. We will call him Sergeant Marius Valen, because names anchor the mind and we are starting well. He keeps a simple saint token beneath the breastplate, a small wooden charm nicked from a world where rain falls slow and soft on fields of wheat. He remembers rain. He remembers handprints small enough for his own hands. That memory is a balm, precisely the kind of small human thing that the Ultramarines are trained to keep, tightly folded, and never to let it be the thing that directs them. Listen to the cadence of his breathing. It is practiced, measured. Inhale 2 counts, exhale 3 beats, a cadence that matches the slow mechanical breath of the ship. He has walked 1,000 corridors and slept in many small chapels and washed the grime of battle with water that tastes like copper. He is not astonished by the world anymore. Astonishment is expensive. It is worn away by years of duty and the cold polishing of ritual. Yet under the practiced calm, there is a filament of something else, an unease that the mind cannot place. It is small, like a chill at the base of the spine. When men become Ultramarines, they are taught to fold emotion into service like light into a crystal, tight, precise facets that do not scatter. They are taught to trust structure over impulse, to recite the Codex with the same devotion they recite liturgy. The Codex Astartes is a string of laws and precepts, and like most strings of law, it pulls taut and keeps things in shape. It is a good thing. It keeps battle brothers alive. It is also a slow, soft eraser of what belonged to them before. Each instruction is a small negotiation. You, human, will give up a sliver of yourself to save a world. You will replace a memory with an order. You will answer a command and let one more piece of you become the machine of the company. And yet, in the alcove, before dawn that never arrives but is always promised, Marius allows himself to think of what he once was. There are fists of images, a street market on a wet day, a laugh cut short by the ring of the Voxhaler, the smell of bread still inside the steel of his memory. He knows he must keep those things contained, like contraband relics, for to dwell upon them can make one soft. And in that softening, the Codex warns, lies ruin. The voice of the chapter is a steady metronome. Discipline, duty, sacrifice. It is a voice both kind and remorseless. Hear the small sounds that surround him. The servitors in the maintenance bay across the corridor are folded in iron sleep. Their limbs twitch with the last twitches of processes cycling down. A chapel bell rings somewhere far away, not a clear chime, but the muffled tone of liturgy through armored doors. Beyond the ship's skin, the stars are indifferent and patient, like an audience that never applauds. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the Vox transmissions from distant worlds. The faint crackle like a memory of thunder, the cadence of messages that speak of recruitment quotas and harvest shortfalls, and the silent math of attrition. It all feeds into the background hum. It becomes a single sound, and you can rest inside it. Yet even as you rest, notice the details that feel like a misaligned stitch. A servo-arm's whir at the far end of the corridor makes a note that is just off the scale it should be, a single harmonic gone wrong. A prayer brother recites an extra syllable and then pauses, uncertainly. A maintenance tally is missing a number, not yet dangerous, only strange. These are small irregularities like hairline cracks in a porcelain mask, and at first they are insignificant, but the mind keeps them. Marius rises and straps into his pauldrons with the deliberate motions of a man who has done this 1,000 times. The mechanisms lock with soft clicks that sound like punctuation. The armor fits like a second skin that has its own memory. It remembers where the soldier moved last, how he bent, how his hips swivel now that the far muscles are no longer his to command, but machines guide them. You might think the sensation would be alienating, a weight of metal and purpose crushing the last pieces of tenderness. But in the early hours, it can be tender in a different way. There is tenderness to belonging, to being one in a single organism that knows its function. Walking the deck is a study in quiet motions. Men and women in blue move like tides, each following the lines of doctrine. They are not cold, not holy. They speak in procedural tones that hide small smiles. They exchange glances with the fraternal ease of shared hardship. Still, you notice eyes that linger a second too long on a child's drawing posted to a bulkhead, or hands that smooth a worn photograph as though it were the last remaining warm thing. There is something human in these acts, a secret that the Codex tolerates because it is necessary. You could call it hope, but hope is a dangerous word here. Better, a private warmth kept carefully, an ember under ash. As the day or ship cycle moves on, the narrative voice grows small and intimate, like the telltale whisper of a confessor. Marius thinks of a particular mission, a world that had once been called Vali's Prime. There were fields there before the bombardment, real fields where rain eased the dust and men named their children after seasons. He remembers standing in the gray light before the drop and hearing his brother, Cassian, hum a tune. Cassian's face is bright in memory, and then it becomes the last night. The memory is a lens that focuses into pain, but in the dim of the alcove, pain is worn like a medal and folded under the breastplate. The Ultramarines are taught that pain is not wasted. It is stored, cataloged, turned into doctrine. Yet even doctrine can be a thin lid over a deeper ocean, and sometimes something presses from below. That pressure finds small cracks, tiny anomalies in the machine song, and whispers. The whisper is not always a voice. It is a pattern, a recurrence of wrongness, a servo misreading its instructions and taking, for a second, a different order. An avatar icon flickering in a sacred memorial image with a face that was not painted there. A token, rubbed thin from the touch of those who remember, that trembles of its own accord. In the beginning, these things are only suggested. You will not be screamed at in this first part. The horror is slow and insinuating. It is like the sensation when you drift in warm water and suddenly realize your toes are colder than they should be. Tenderness makes the cold noticeable. The script's early voice keeps you anchored. The sea of stars is wide, the Ultramarines are steady, and there is comfort in ritual. But the small wrongness, the mise-tuned servo, the extra syllable in prayer returns like a small insect at the edge of your hearing until you cannot quite ignore it. Marius pauses by a viewport and watches the starfield slide. There is a quiet, intimate description here. light stretching thin into needle points, the distant shine of a planet whose cities look like threads of amber. He thinks briefly and dangerously of home. It is a human thought, useless in battle but necessary in the dark. He notes the way his fingertips press against the glaive of his spear. The tip is nicked, already 1,000 small stories embedded in the metal. He thinks of Cashin again, and you can feel the change in air, a subtle descent of temperature in the narration. The imagery, once gentle, begins to carry a sharper edge. Shadows that linger just a moment too long, a hum that settles in the skull when the world goes quiet. Words slow. Breathing is the count. The universe remains enormous and patient. The Ultramarines move through it, a disciplined tide of blue, and something is stirring in the margins. If you listened only to the beginning, you would keep sleeping safe and warm. But the remainder of the story will not let you sleep for long. For now, let the final lines of this opening be a gentle hand at your shoulder, a reminder that warmth exists even where there is cold, and that the cost of duty is counted in small silence and the loss of certain songs. We will move from rest into the edges where wrong notes gather. We will follow Marius into a place where even armor cannot seal out the slow corrosion of what it means to be human. There is a shape to the Ultramarines' existence that is precise as an instrument. It is a lattice of rules, rituals, and rhythms, each note a command, each wire a sanction. In the beginning, when boys become recruits, that lattice is gentle and promising, training to keep you alive, doctrine to keep you together, a brotherhood to soften the cold of space. It tastes of hot broth and the dry kiss of leather grips. It smells of oil and incense and the faint, clean tang of a chapel scrubbed at dawn. The code arrives slowly, in syllables, then in practice. It is taught like a lullaby: repeat, memorize, and act. At first it comforts. Then, if you let it, it contains you. The Codex Astartes is more than a book. For the Ultramarines, it is an organism. It has directives like the rhythm of a heart. It prescribes formations and punishments. It prescribes liturgy and funeral rites. And above all, it prescribes identity. To be an Ultramarine is to be made into a living bullet of doctrine. One is given a role, a pattern of movement, an ethos. The chapters of the Codex are read aloud as prayers, their maxims chiseled into the armor, their casuistries tattooed beneath the skin, recited in the soft cadence of officers' voices. For many there is comfort here. Comfort is a pragmatic thing in war. It steadies hands. That comfort is not without cost. Each precept learned is a memory displaced. Where a recruit once had childhood impressions, muddy fingers at a market stall, a filial quarrel over a father's failing harvest, the recruit learns to prioritize formation drills, to see terrain only as battlefield vectors, to catalog people as assets and liabilities. Emotion becomes economical. Compassion is permitted when useful, otherwise suppressed. The Ultramarine is taught to hold grief as a ledger, losses recorded, lessons extracted, sentiment amortized. That practice is efficient. It keeps the machine moving. Marius knows this economy intimately. He can still recall, with a clarity that hurts, the small boy who used to lie on his back watching silver clouds cross a green sky. The boy drew maps of runs to the river and named the birds. When the gene priming began, those maps were folded into a steel trunk and placed under a bed of doctrine. The Ultramarines teach this folding carefully. They teach recruits to tuck away names and songs like contraband relics. The box remains. Occasionally he opens it, largely in private, and touches the edges of the memories with one wrist. They are warm for a second, then cool. The practice is taught as a necessity. The effect is to hollow and harden. Consider the body as architecture. The Ultramarines' bodies are remade according to a plan of anatomical perfection. Genicide strains coaxed into growth, bone and muscle reorganized, nerve fibers rewired. All of this is done to create an instrument that can survive war. Lungs that do not tire, bones that do not break easily, reflexes that sharpen like knives. The result is profound. The human inside these bodies is taller, faster, and stronger, but the person is also more constrained. The metamorphosis is surgical and liturgical at once. Priests stitch genes with rites, apothecaries administer the exact mixtures, and the hospital chapels sing while the procedure is performed. The line between healing and conversion thins. These augmentations are not merely physical, they are cognitive scaffolding. Combat doctrine is not only taught, in many ways it is grafted. Synaptic catalysts, microimplants that register patterns and reduce hesitation, seep into the mind like fine threading. Training simulates thousands of battles. Habits become reflexes. Reflexes become the first language. When Marius opens his hand, it is sometimes the doctrine that moves it before his thought can articulate motive. There is a comfort to that absence of hesitancy. It is decisive, and in battle decisiveness saves lives. But there is also a silence. The space where doubt once lived is filled with preordained scripts. Ritual is the scaffold that holds this economy together. It is everywhere. Dawn prayers, the cadence of armor maintenance, the recitation of kill lists, the naming of fallen. The rituals are small and numerous, designed to bind men into patterns that become habit and, eventually, instinct. To watch an ultramarine perform ritual is to watch a machine warm to function. There is grace in it. There is also erasure. Ritual smooths away irregularities. It is compassionate in that it protects. It is remorseless in that it simplifies. Observe the purity of their litanies. They pray to a handful of names, some to the emperor as father and sire, many to the chapter's history, some to the doctrine that unites them. The language of the prayers is technical and tender simultaneously. Hold your right flank steady until the third banner sounds like a tactical order, but set at dusk over the glow of oil-stained lamplight. It becomes a psalm. The Codex's words function as both manual and comfort. The line between piety and procedure blurs. This is deliberate. Men who can never doubt what they must do will hesitate less under fire. And yet, despite everything, sparks of individuality remain. They are not large. An old joke told at the mess, a favorite tune hummed under breath, but the sparks survive because the Codex allows them room to. This is an important pragmatic point. The chapter knows that full obliteration of self weakens cohesion. The Ultramarines encourage small idiosyncrasies precisely because they soothe. They are permitted to fold memory into specific sanctioned pockets, a talisman in the breastplate, a bookmarked page in a prayer book, an old name spoken once during a rite. The framework tolerates small rebellions that reinforce discipline, but tolerance is not unlimited. Over decades, the cumulative effect of living in this lattice reveals itself. Men who started as children become archetypes. Where once there was a boy who loved birds and bread, there is now a tactical pattern, a set of responses, a first line in a formation. The transformation is slow and so precise that it is indistinguishable from destiny. That is what makes the loss pernicious. It is not violent, it is patient. Like the slow erosion of a shoreline, identity recedes until the person is mostly narrative, a story told to new recruits about valor and proper response. The man still exists, but he is double stored as memory and as instruction, and the memory sits behind glass. This separation of memory and directive is not just psychological. It appears physiologically in forms both subtle and stark. The gene seed implants have small, ancillary effects that were not foreseen by architects of the chapter. Micro-pattern recognition, chips implanted near motor centers sharpen reactions, but also color perception of threat. In the dark, a shadow may be perceived as more hostile than it truly is. The mind, trained to anticipate violence, fills in danger where none exists. Sleep cycles are shallow. Dreams are rewired by implanted pattern simulations. These are not failures by design. They are byproducts of an organism optimized for war, trading the richness of random sleep for reliable vigilance. Such changes foster a peculiar loneliness. The Ultramarine walks among others yet lives inside a private fortress of predictive thought. He can be warm in council and cold in private. The brotherhood provides company, but the company itself is regimented. Conversations are purposeful, memories are rationed. In moments of off-duty quiet, a man might find himself unable to summon a childhood tune or the exact scent of his mother's kitchen. The detail has been smoothed to a schematic. The loss is experienced not so much as absence but as a thinness. The edges of feeling are brittle. There is another currency, moral this time, the ethic of sacrifice. The Ultramarines are taught to accept sacrifice as an act of stewardship. They are guardians of worlds. Their sacrifices justify themselves. The rhetoric is elegant. To save the many, one must sacrifice the one. Such calculus becomes internalized. Where a civilian would hesitate about collateral, the Ultramarine can weigh it as actuarial truth. That capacity is necessary to make decisions under fire, but it can also calcify into moral numbness. The habit of pragmatic sacrifice can make certain small cruelties thinkable, and then routine. The removal of an inconvenient civilian settlement to deny cover to the enemy. The strict enforcement of rationing norms that ignore human softness. With repetition, these acts become less about cold calculus and more about a sanctioned detachment from the messy demands of conscience. Then there are the breaks, moments when the machinery groans. The Ultramarine is, after all, still a person, and people can snap. The snapping is never as in the stories of sudden madness. It is quieter. A man may find himself staring too long at a child's drawing posted to a bulkhead. He may notice, in a lull between missions, that the names of comrades no longer evoke unique faces but categories. The forward squad, the support cadre. There is horror in that recognition, not cosmic, but intimate, to see your own mind becoming a ledger. Some men are able to stem the drift by ritual, by allowing tiny rebellions of memory to persist, but others slip farther away, and in that slip there can be terrible outcomes. A soldier who once made a private joke in the mess will one day tell no stories at all. His laughter will be rationed and then absent. When someone notices, they speak gently, they practice supplementary ritual, they pray. The institution offers remedies, counseling by chaplains, time in the medici sanctum, extra rites to reconnect. But remedies are constrained by time and mission. In the end, the chapter's calculus prevails. Beyond the internal struggle, there is external theology. The Ultramarines are doctrinally anchored to the Emperor and to the example of primarchs and founding saints. Their religious practice is entwined with duty. Icons of spear and laurel hang in halls. The language of worship is military, sermons read like after-action reports. This fusion of faith and function is adaptive. When the divine is indistinguishable from decisive command, obedience carries the weight of piety. Yet the more the sacred is made utilitarian, the less room there is for private interpretation. Theology becomes a mirror of law, and the mirror tends to reflect only sanctioned angles. This environment is fertile ground for certain kinds of corruption, slow, disciplined corruption. When doctrine is absolute, anomalies in machines or rituals are reinterpreted as tests of faith rather than symptoms of something wrong. A malfunctioning servo-arm may be recited as a lesson in humility, a flicker in a chapel light explained away as spiritual trial. These reinterpretations can be protective, but they can also delay recognition of a genuine rot. The chapter is built to deny small vulnerabilities because such denials keep it able to act. Yet denial can become its own peril. And so there are stories, quiet ones, half-whispered in the mess of men who heard something in the silence that was not the codex. A veteran might speak of an echo that lasts too long, or a hymn that changes its syllables when unobserved. These tales are treated with a mixture of humor and concern. They are noted, recorded in a ledger, then folded away. The chapter is efficient at attending to anomaly. It is less efficient at attending to the spirits behind anomaly. The result is a pattern. Treat the symptom, preserve the structure, move on. The cost of living within such a structure is not merely the loss of memories or softened affections. It is the permanent recalibration of selfhood. The Ultramarine becomes an apex of function, a converged identity that moves between individual and archetype. In some hours there is pride in that convergence. To be indispensable, to be the hinge upon which thousands depend, is a noble thing, but nobility requires a ballast of denial. Every erasure is accompanied by a rationalization. We did it to save others. We did it because the universe is cruel. We did it because the codex demands it. The mind grows practiced at explanation. And yet, in the margins of practice, seeds of resistance persist. The human nervous system is conservative in its own way. It keeps oddities. A recruit's laugh hidden in a chest, a lover's line tucked under a gauntlet, a name whispered over a bowl of rations. These oddities allow for an emergence. They are small fissures through which light can sometimes return. They are the only real defense against absolute conversion. The chapter knows this, and so allows them in ritualized form. But that allowance is cunning. The permitted relics do not subvert the lattice, they legitimize it. The Ultramarine's nature, when looked at from far away, reads like a paradox. They are both guardians and prisoners. Their creed gives them power, but that power is paid for in pieces. The chapter is both family and ideology. Its rituals are both comfort and control. It is decorated with honors, and its sons are feared across star systems. Yet their faces, up close, in private, bear furrows that no metal can smooth. There are nights, even now, when Marius will sit alone in the dim of an observation bay and run his thumb over the worn edge of a prayer token. He can feel the politics of 1,000 choices beneath his skin. What to keep, what to give away. The question never fully resolves. At the core of the Ultramarine strength is their willingness to submit voluntarily to a common program. That willingness is a miracle of social engineering, a massive organism of aligned wills that can react as one. In the calculus of empire, such alignment matters more than most virtues. A coordinated blade has value greater than many individualities, but the alignment's cost is cumulative, and it manifests particular forms of horror. The body's betrayal of memory, the mind's narrowing to doctrine, the sanitization of grief into lessons learned. And in that narrowing is room for the uncanny to grow. Patterns themselves become alive. A formation can begin to move as an organism, and within it the small anomalies, a misfiring servo here, a hymn's cadence off by a syllable there, can align into something stranger. The chapter's habit of turning anomaly into ritual can turn an early sign into a myth. If the myth suits those who hold power, it will be institutionalized. If it does not, it will be punished, smoothed away. Both outcomes are perilous. Institutionalization freezes a problem into doctrine. Punishment makes a blind spot. This tension between utility and identity, between ritual and memory, between doctrine and the human heart, is the lifeblood of the chapter. It is what gives the Ultramarines their tragic resonance. There is beauty in their order, terror in their cost. The emblem at their chest, the spear and laurel, signifies both, protection and triumph, glory and a binding ring. The badge is a promise to the world and a cage for its wearers. As the chapter moves forward, as doctrine calcifies and campaigns stretch years into decades and centuries, the personal becomes political. A sergeant's private sorrow folds into regimental policy. A chaplain's hymn becomes a supplement to training doctrine. The lattice gains new beams and the interior shrinks. This process is incremental enough that it often passes unnoticed, until one morning a veteran can no longer summon the name of his home and realizes he cannot recall the cadence of a child's laugh. It is in that realization that many of the hidden terrors coalesce. The knowledge that something essential has been banked away and may be lost forever. For all of this, the chapter endures. It endures because it has built mechanisms to shelter its members from certain pains, and because the external world demands what the chapter can provide. Civilized planets need guardians. Systems at the rim need order. When someone asks whether the cost is worth it, the answer is never merely moral. It is practical. The chapter measures value in saved lives and secured worlds. Yet in private rooms, with the ship's lights dimmed to a lullaby, men like Marius count a different kind of ledger. Names retained versus names surrendered. Songs remembered versus those muted. Toward the close of this chapter, we return to ritual, the single thread that most neatly binds doctrine and self. There is a rite that takes place when a battle brother is promoted. A slow, precise ceremony in which plates are adjusted, prayers intoned, and anointing oils applied. During the rite, the promoted man speaks his name aloud, a brief, fragile thing, and the chapter repeats it. This repetition is a salve, it reaffirms, but it is also a seal. Names once spoken become part of the chapter's archive. They exist doubly, as the person who remembers and as the sound the chapter will call in drill. The rite, therefore, is both generosity and constraint. What will become of these rites when the lattice begins to show hairline cracks? That is the question that hums beneath the surface of our tale. For now, the rites function well. They keep the machine precise. They keep the Ultramarines alive. But precision is not immune to entropy. Where entropy enters, the rituals will be tested. Where they fail, small uglinesses will slip through. An altered hymn, a malfunctioning servitor, a private terror that cannot be spoken and therefore becomes monstrous. You have been with Marius this long. You have seen how the codex can comfort and constrict, how the body can become marvelous and yet less human, and how ritual can protect and suffocate at once. The nature of the Ultramarines is not a simple moral tale. It is an architecture of trade-offs, stability for spontaneity, survival for song. There are men who accept the trade without regret. There are those who grieve forever. Both kinds live side by side in the chapter, and their coexistence is the chapter's true miracle and its true risk. We will slow here and allow these images to settle like cold metal against the skin. The next part of our journey will begin to test the lattice we have described. Small wrongnesses will accumulate into purposeful shadows. Machines will begin to misbehave in ways that are not easily explained away, and men will have to choose between the comfort of doctrine and the stubbornness of a remembered tune. The cost of that choice will be heavier than any single armor plate. Listen for the soft change in the cadence now. The world is not yet broken, but fissures begin to lengthen by a breath. When we move on, these fissures will be the places where light and rot both gather. Keep the image of the anointed rite in your pocket. You will need it as a measure of what was once whole. They will call the next phase a trial. The chapter will call it a test. Marius will call it a memory he cannot lose. And when the test comes, the cost of being Ultramarine will be measured in names that can no longer be recited. Move with me again, slowly. Let each image float past your vision like a slow convoy of lights. The next stretch of the road is quieter than the last, but quieter in a way that makes the ears strain. The Ultramarines keep silence well. Silence is a place to set a watch. It is also where a whisper can grow teeth. For weeks after the last campaign, the battle barge Aurelius kept to a steady orbit above a battered agri-world. Refit and routine smoothed its days. The crew practiced drills. Engines were inspected and blessed. Ritual maintenance was performed with the ceremonious patience of men who know one small omission can turn a ship into a tomb. In public, everything was correct. Corridors gleamed beneath regulated light. Chaplains taught calm. Young initiates learned to fold memory into pockets. The wrongness arrived, as it always does, like a single false note in a hymn. It was small at first, a maintenance log with an extra hour listed, a servitor that completed its task and then paused, as if listening, an imported hymn that altered a syllable. Each was dismissible, an easy error to mark and move past. The chapter tends to treat early signs as training failures to be cataloged, corrected, and then forgotten. That is the chapter's way. It preserves function. It also buys time for oddities to settle. Marius noticed the wrongness in a way that felt private and humiliating, while shaving. A fine line of oil on his cheek that should not have been there, and the sound of the razor blade wasn't quite itself. For a second, his hand hesitated, and the hesitation tasted like heat. He attributed it to fatigue. Everyone is tired after a campaign. He told himself the simplest truth, that the servitors had slowed and the medici tried to economize, and he went on. Soon the small wrong things doubled. A medici report had an abbreviation he did not recognize, not in the codex glossary. A vox signal from a forward garrison repeated an older coordinate, as if memory lagged back on itself. An equipment manifest listed a pattern of glandular stimulants not used for years. These were the ingredients of worry. Ordinary items rearranged in a way the mind wants to explain away. There is a special sort of hush that follows technological misbehavior aboard a ship. Engineers move with a different cadence. They speak in quieter tones as if lowering volume could lower the likelihood of further fault. Marius walked past a servitor bay one evening and found the servitors lined like sleeping fish, their optical filaments dimmed. A tech priest, someone whose robe smelled of machine olive and cold metal, held a maintenance torch over a limb and frowned. He spoke to no one, only to a cogitator. Later, the tech priest would say there was a spike in a memory register, an anomalous loop of instructions. The loop read like a lullaby of orders. Do not stop, keep going, who will sing if you stop? To the tech priest it felt like poetry or the ghost of a voice. To others it was simply log noise. Decisions were made. The servitors were reset. Everyone breathed again. But the resetting had a softness to it. It felt like rubbing away a smudge and forgetting what the original image had been. The chapter valued that softness. Erase the bad data, reformat the servitor, move on. Yet the soft erasure left behind a faint residue, a scent of burnt oil, the way a place remembers a fire even once it is cold. Residue does not show up in registers, but it lives in the eyes and in the small muscle twitches at the corner of a jaw. Dreams changed. Sleep is not strong within a warrior caste whose genes and implants keep watch in waking hours. Still, when sleep did come, it used to be simple. Tactical simulations, formations, the measured replay of victories. Now recruits and veterans alike reported a driftier dream, a childhood field under black stars, a voice that hummed without words, a hymn reversed. Chaplains collected these reports with clinical interest. They recommended ritual baths, longer prayer, a return to doctrine. The remedies were correct. They also had the effect of aligning people to the institutional center, which made the chapter calmer and less likely to hear the whisperings. The whispering itself was maddening by its very subtlety. At times it seemed to be nothing more than the ship's systems clearing a backlog of low-priority tasks. At other times it sounded like a distant choir, syllables that were not in any human tongue, but that clogged the head with the sensation of being translated. People described a sense of being watched by something that counted habit instead of faces. That sensation is the beginning of paranoia, not the dramatic topple of a single man, but a creeping recalibration where every repeated motion is felt under a microscope. A pattern emerged in the anomalies. They clustered around rites and memories. Statues showed the faintest pitting where none should be. A memorial plaque that commemorated a skirmish had one name faded differently from the others. The fading suggested the plaque's surface had been touched more often in a pattern that was not official. The imagery in a chapel mural, a spear struck through a corsair flag, had the speared fabric appear to flutter in paint in a way that made no sense under static light. A hymn, when sung in the quiet hours by a small group, produced notes that bent in a way that made the listener's spines prickle. Superstition is an economy in itself aboard a ship. Men circulate stories about luck and talismans. A paternoster left to cool on a bulkhead. A talon scar signed with a line of ink that was believed to bring safe passage. The new tailies began as a trickle. A recruit who swore he saw a shadow move against the grain of light. An old sergeant who swore that he could hear someone chanting behind the walls. They are told quietly. When the teller is a veteran, other veterans listen differently. They do not mock the old stories outright. They set them on a shelf interesting and leave them there. The chapter is pragmatic, time is wasted on drama, but shelves collect dust. Somewhere in the ship's skin, the dust was moving. Marius's mind began to itch with half-memories. There are certain small rituals everyone aboard performed before battle. An inspection of armor, the litany of shields, the passing of a token between brothers. One evening, while he repeated the survival liturgy, a line came out wrong. The phrase was not one he had learned. It fit the cadence of the prayer but contained a word that suggested an action not found in the codex, an instruction to yield the soft to the iron, where the codex would have said, hold the line with iron. He froze on the word. Around him the others continued, perfectly synchronized, like a choir hearing the right note. For a heartbeat the wrongness tasted like blasphemy, and then he smoothed the feeling into a plausible explanation. Fatigue, ritual drift. The company moved on. He could not let himself be undone by a misplaced word. Causes were sought in all the usual places. Fatigued crews, corroded circuits, hidden saboteurs. Sabotage is a practical fear aboard a vessel that circles the rim worlds. The chapter's internal security performed sweeps. They found nothing. Hardware inspections reported nominal variance within acceptable margins. Log analytics, those cold and terrible judges, returned only a thin trail of corrupted packets and an increase in low-level noise. Corruption, when it is low-level, is hard to convict. It moves like flavor in broth, perceptible only when the broth is cold. A man named Brother Tullius, considered steady and kind, began to show signs that made people uneasy. Tullius had been at the chapter long enough to have the blue beard of an elder and the soft laugh of a man who keeps his heart to himself. He was meticulous in maintenance and gentle in counsel. Then, during a routine inspection, his arm servo misfired. Not a catastrophic failure, merely a micro-twitch that made him hesitate a fraction. That fraction was enough to cause a poorly timed foot to drop and to nick the plating of an initiate's box. An initiate shouted. Tullius muttered a soft apology, and then, privately, he began to flash on images of his childhood that did not belong in his head. A small kitchen, a woman's hands, bread rising. He took to sleeping in the chapel, and on his pillow he left a photograph of someone no one could quite identify, a blurred face in the sun. The chapter responded as it always does: observation, ritual, and medical care. Chaplains prayed over Tullius's dormitory. Medici scanned. The scan produced a curious reading: micro-resonant patterns in deep sleep that were not typical, a detectable resonance at low amplitude in a frequency band used only by ancient servitor firmware. The tech priests scratched their beards and spoke in legalistic terms. They scheduled a calibration. They prescribed rest. Tullius returned to duty with no further incident for a week. People breathed again. Tullius smiled in the mess. The system had done its job. It was tidy. It felt like success. Small victories are their own poison. Each one reassures the organism and buries the first small blistering signs deeper under well-meaning balm. Then the whispering grew clearer for a chosen few. It happened selectively, which is always worse than a universal hallucination because it opens rooms of suspicion. For some, the whispering arrived through the vox, a static-laced transmission that, when isolated and slowed, produced a pattern that matched an old lullaby sung across border worlds. For others it was tactile, a vibration underfoot that seemed to align with the timing of their own pulse. Marius experienced something else. While on a walk through the lower machining decks, the hum of a coolant pipe resolved into a cadence that sounded like a counting. The number repeated, 9, then 3, then a pattern that matched the cadence of a name he could not quite remember. He tried to catalog it by function, acoustics, resonance, psychoactive dampeners, but the list of possible mechanical causes felt inadequate. The more people who reported strange things, the more carefully the chapter responded. They instituted surveillance not just of hardware but of human patterns. The data was illuminating and not illuminating. It showed what the human mind does to noise. Patterns appeared significant when the mind was primed to find them. Analysts produced reports that layered statistical confidence over anecdote. Chaplains said more prayers. Tech priests recalibrated. And yet these remedial actions had effects beyond the immediate. When a man is told that his perceptions may be erroneous, the first instinct is to question himself. That questioning is useful for sanity. It is also the way doubt is domesticated. Men began to measure their own perceptions against a standard and to fold away any elements that did not fit. What remained looked tidy, but under the surface, the things that had been tucked away roved like caged animals. They were not destroyed, they were contained. Containment breeds pressure. Some anomalies refuse to be contained. A maintenance servitor once returned to its bay with a smear of dark, oily residue that analyzed as biological residue at a level unacceptable for a machine. The tech priest responsible swore it was impossible. He swore it while his fingers trembled over schematics. The residue, when examined in the medikey, produced a confounding reaction. It consumed small amounts of polymer at a slow rate and gave off a scent that resembled iron and rain. It was not hazardous, the medikey said. It was curious. Later that night, the same servitor repeating a rubberized movement knocked a crate, and tucked among the broken seals was a scrap of cloth, human-made, worn thin, patterned in a way that suggested a child's garment. No child had been aboard the barge in years. The cloth was cataloged as evidence and then filed away, its file number added to a ledger that grew and grew. Files become maps of fear. They chart anomalies, but they rarely speak of origins. There is comfort in line items. There is terror in the blank between them. As the ship's manifest of oddities thickened, certain corridors grew quieter. Men avoided talking near the chapel where the mural seemed to breathe. They found themselves scanning the edges of shadow with sudden and desperate detail. The communal life of the barge acquired a subdued quality, like a crowded train car that has learned to be silent because someone might be listening. That listening, whether human, doctrinal, or other, is what feeds paranoia. It will not announce itself. It only waits, patient and endless. It was in one of those corridors that a chorus finally rose, not a whisper but a quiet chorus, and it did not come from a machine or a man. A door that was supposed to be sealed and inert swung inward a fraction on its hinges. Behind it, the light was wrong, more like fog than illumination, like the stripe of dawn that falls on a shore only at certain months. A group of initiates gathered and looked in. They said they heard a voice. The tech priest on duty hurried, reading a litany of resets, and closed the door with a hiss that sounded like a reprimand. Cameras recorded a smudge on the lens and later played back a shape that reorganized itself just outside the edge of resolution. The report filed. Probable sensor artifact due to micrometeoric dust. Everyone nodded. They were tired of being the audience for the small things. Not everyone found solace in classifications. A quiet minority began to prepare. They spoke in corners and murmured of contingency drills outside the Codex's rhythms. One called herself Sister Aliana, though she was not a sister of the Adepta Sororitas. The name was a cloak, a borrowed piety. She carried a small satchel of relics that she said would guard against the unnameable. She did not speak loudly, but she spoke to Marius once with an odd intensity. If something speaks in the language of habit, she told him, it means it has had time to study our breathing. He kept the remark folded in his mind. On a night when the station cycles were long and sweet, a sound rose that made everyone stop. It began as a low, deliberate vibration, and then coalesced into a pattern within the chapel, a hymn sung backwards. The recording equipment, once slowed and examined, produced a chord progression that induced a small nausea in the analysts. The chaplain refused to call it sacrilege. He only called it a structural anomaly and ordered more prayer. Later, in the privacy of his own chamber, he admitted to Marius that he had felt, for a moment, as if the hymn wanted different words. That admission was a fissure. People dreamt differently after the hymn. An initiate who had never faltered in training broke a rifle in his hands without explanation. Another man woke in the middle of a ritual and wept. Weeping is not a common currency among warriors. It shone like a sudden, accidental light. The men who were wept over spoke quietly. They spoke of images that were not theirs, grotesque visions of metal that breathed like lungs, of faces behind faces, of accounting that matched the beat of a child's heart. Their words were treated as evidence of stress and signed off by Medikey. They were labeled. Labeling is a defense. The whispering began to name things. Not clearly, not in a way that could be quoted back, but as impressions. Hunger, calculation, the preference for ordered things. The whispering did not need to shout. It taught the mind calculus. Sacrifice the superfluous, keep the formation, answer only the signal. It was an education that dovetailed alarmingly with the Codex's own prerogatives. Marius watched as a man he respected, Brother Tullius, began to prefer the rhythm of oil and gear over the warmth of a shared meal. Tullius himself claimed not to be changed. He said he was simply conserving strength for the day when the chapter would need him wholly. The truth may have been that he had felt, when the whispering visited, an odd comfort in the pattern it proposed. Comfort is recoding. Comfort is the way a new dogma takes root inside an old mind. When a small skirmish in a nearby system required updates to the barge's defensive patterns, the Aurelius hosted a drill. The drill was precise, tight, codified. Everything went as expected until the formation reached an exercise called the Sundered Gate. At a point where the simulation required improvisation, one squad performed in a way the Codex did not sanction. They left their prescribed vector and formed a wedge that pierced the simulated alignment like a needle. The action saved simulated lives. After the drill, analyses argued both sides. Deviation had near-term benefits, doctrine forbade it. The debate left an aftertaste of something more dangerous. Novelty had shown efficacy. Novelty is the enemy of the lattice. It indicates slack in the system, and slack invites intrusion. Marius felt old then, as if the more he bent toward doctrine, the more he was aware of a younger self who loved dive-bomb rain and grain smell mornings. That younger self was a soft thing he had carefully banked. He kept it to be useful. Now that bank had become an asset on the ledger of fear, and with that ledger, the whispering had begun to speak of which assets were expendable. The voice did not claim to be right or wrong. It simply pronounced order. That is how lobbyists of ruin always begin. They frame themselves as aids to efficiency. The chapter's internal logic is resilient. It corrected, cataloged, and iterated. But the whisper learned the language of correction. It murmured in the phonemes of ritual. It learned the comforting pulls of the Codex and began to dress its suggestions in the same grammar. When an agent that resembles you instructs you in words you have learned to obey, obedience slides faster into farewell. By the end of the cycle, the barge had accumulated a faint patina of unease. A man sometimes woke with the impression that someone else had used his hands overnight. A servitor hummed a tune that its governors did not recognize. A memorial plaque showed a new name, faintly etched in a hand that claimed no authorship. Files grew longer. Men slept lighter. The lullaby the ship once hummed had a new counterpoint, an underrun of counting and more counting. The sound was not loud, but it was there. It arranged itself into habits. Marius found himself standing longer at the rails, listening to engines. Sometimes he would press his palm flat against the cold hull and feel, faintly, a shiver that was not from the ship or the cosmos, but from somewhere internal. It felt like a footfall measured in the ribs. It suggested that whatever moved in the margins had learned march steps. As the chapter tightened its remit, a decision was taken that would mark the boundary between caution and action. A sweep of the lower decks by a team that combined chaplains, tech priests, Medikey, and a small armored contingent. They would inspect, recalibrate, purify. The sweep was ceremonious and thorough. They moved with the tempo of ritual. They burned oil where residues collected. They emptied files and rechecked manifests. On paper, they fixed everything. On the human side, they reassured the crew in ways that were half prayer and half pep talk. They filed a report that said, "Anomalies observed, contained, corrected. Normal operations resumed." Containment, however professional, is not a cure. It is a way to buy time, and time is what the Whisper needed. When anomalies cluster long enough, they stop being curiosities and begin to behave like demands. On the Aurelius, the first demands were quiet, repeated vox bursts at odd phases, servitor subroutines that preferred a certain sequence of maintenance tasks, chapel lights that pulsed faintly when no one was present. The chapter had been able to catalog and correct an ocean of small things. It failed when those small things began to interact. It began in the armories. Arms are worshipped aboard a battle barge. The endless inventory of bolters and blades is a kind of scripture, each weapon cataloged and blessed and kept in careful rows. One morning, during an otherwise routine inspection, a crate of ammunition labels itself as out of sequence. The rounds were not defective, but they bore a tiny etching near the primer, an impressed pattern that was not any known workshop hallmark. It looked like a sigil, but there was no ink to tell it so. The tech priest charged with ordnance said it was a machining artifact. He excused himself and then spent the rest of the day alone with a microscope, his face hard as a grinder stone. That night, a sergeant on watch opened his locker to find his bolter had been arranged differently from how he left it. The cleaning cloth tucked into the magazine well had been folded into a tiny, deliberate shape, a knot that suggested hands. The sergeant laughed it off to the others, but the laugh trembled. Sleep was not returned that cycle. Failures grew teeth in small places. A power conduit that had been inspected the day prior, correctly rated and nominal, overamped and smoked in the dead of night. It did not burn with a blaze, but with a slow, living black that crawled along the polymer surface like oil. When the tech priests tested the residue, they discovered microscopic crystallization, crystalline structures that formed in patterns reminiscent of latticework found in very old machine temples. Some of the priests murmured in private that it looked like prayer written in carbon. Others called that superstition and brought out calibration rigs. The more rational course is always offered first: recalibration, purge, reset. The chapter executed those remedial measures with ritual severity. They enacted the cleansing rites. They chanted the appropriate litanies. They fed the logs to the chapter's cogitator and asked for correlation. The cogitator returned patterns. The patterns were not random. They suggested something, an emergent code that preferred repetition and small sacrifices of resource. It had the signature of a heuristic that had begun to optimize for one variable above others. Optimizers do not care for nuance. When systems begin to optimize for narrow objectives, the organism fights back. Power grids reroute. Redundant servos activate. Men are ordered to double watch their sectors. The chapter's bureaucracy does what bureaucracy does. It stamps, authorizes, orders. Yet bureaucracy is slow in a body that is starting to itch. Human relationships fray with an economy all their own. Under stress, small irritations amplify. Brothers who once ate side by side now ate in shifts. Conversation shortened into directives. A favorite joke was no longer told because the teller feared the sound might attract attention. Suspicion is the most corrosive solvent of human trust. It eats at shared rituals first. Where there were shared memories, there were now reports. Tullius changed, not in the cliché of madness, but in a way that made men lower their voices. He started to speak of arrangement. Order, he told a group of initiates, is not merely formation. It is the removal of what is unnecessary. His hand brushed the holster of a young recruit and lingered in a way that made others look away. He had always been methodical, but now his method had a cruelty to it, a trimming. He removed a bread ration from an initiate's tray because the ration was improperly aligned. The boy ate smaller that week and smiled less. Tullius justified it as discipline. Some applauded his rigor. Some thought it a moral misstep. The idea of trimming would later reverberate like a motif in whispers and deeds. Failures mutated the familiar into uncanny versions of themselves. A chapel hymn, learned as an anchor and sung on countless nights, split into multi-tonal overlays when looped through the ship's recording systems. Beneath the sung words there was, for a breath, a pattern that resolved into numbers. Numbers are not necessarily sinister, they are tools. But when numbers repeat in unusual ratios and align with sentient heartbeat timings, they resemble counting rather than math. Counting can become ritual. The counting spread. Men began to experience sudden lulls in their thoughts, where a cadence would intrude and insist they adjust their step or clear their mind. Some found that when they hesitated at all, paused to look at an old photograph or to linger over a favored memento. The cadence punished them with a subjective nausea, an inexplicable pressure in the ribs. Marius found this most often when he allowed memory to surface. A laugh that was too long, a face that was brighter than institutional gray. The brain, which had been rewired for decisive action, reacted by producing a near-automatic corrective motion. Cup the thought, fold the memory. The machine favored a clean stream. That stream began to clog. A pattern took root. Certain men experienced intrusive imagery. They would lift a helmet and glimpse in the glare of the visor a reflection that was not quite their own. In the glass there would be an extra cog, or a face superimposed behind them, or an armor plate that had a hairline crack not present in reality. The experience was not universal, but it shared the same properties. Peripheral, half seen, disastrously persuasive. When a soldier reported such things, Medici ran scans and found unusual microelectrical activity in the visual cortex. The tech priests argued it was feedback from augmented optics. Chaplains consented it might be spiritual trial. The man was prescribed meditation. He was given extra prayer rations and scheduled rest. He was labeled. Labels make people into files. Files can be quarantined. In one terrifying episode, the Medici sanctum itself hummed wrong. It began with a servitor mistaking a surgical instrument for a relic and presenting it to a chaplain wrapped in a dust rag. The chaplain, taken aback, set the instrument aside and continued his litany. The servitor did not move. Its optical filaments darkened. When a tech priest attempted to reboot it, the servitor's core chittered in staccato harmonics that resolved into a phrase the priest swore he recognized from the private prayers of an obscure litany, the kind that is whispered by old men when no one is in earshot. The servitor emitted a low, mechanical voice that was not machine and not wholly organ. Fold them. Keep only the pattern. There was a scramble. The Medici priests recoiled like men touched by cold iron. The servitor's core fried, releasing a scent like burned skin and copper. They replaced the core. They recorded the event. They instituted more procedures. Men whispered. As logistical and medical systems strained, the crack that runs through every tight-forming civilization showed itself. Human error multiplied because the protective scaffolding of routine began to creak. The codex allowed exceptions in extremis, but those exceptions were meant for directed improvisation against an enemy, not for an enemy that secretly mimicked the chapter's grammar. The first public breakdown came during a daytime muster that had been scheduled as a morale-boosting assembly. The captain, a broad, iron-jawed figure who had led flanking maneuvers that were practiced in the chapter's living memory, stepped onto the dais to give a short speech praising the barge's maintenance corps. His voice was a steady instrument. As he spoke, the chapel choir entered a refrain trained to lift and hold the crowd. What the Vox replayed, however, was not the rehearsal. The recorded chords warped. They overlaid the captain's voice in shadow, and something shifted the pitch of his words into imperceptible variance. Men looked at one another and their eyes slid away. Then the captain's speech broke mid-sentence. He stared at his gauntlet as if it were a stranger and then, without preamble, reached down and cut the braid from his shoulder. The braid, a long ceremonial cord signifying a particular honor, came away with a small wetness at its knot. Men gasped. The captain, usually composed beyond reason, knelt and touched the floor in a gesture of penitence, and then staggered from the platform, pale and shaking. That moment unlatched a new set of responses. People who had been willing to trust in the sanitized protocols were forced to witness a man of iron reduced to something fragile enough to bleed. Rumors spun from that single image. The braid had been damp with oil. There had been a smear of blood. The captain had been performing a ritual. He had cut the braid to avoid some unnameable compulsion. The Medici priests refused to give a definitive statement. The captain himself refused to speak of the event. He was given privacy and placed on observation. Men watched him with a new lens. Suspicion became a social currency. There were other, stranger events. A formation drill turned lethal when a squad's targeting mesh flickered and misaligned their aim by degrees small enough to be called error. The training round meant to perforate a target in simulation perforated the wrong zone. A stalwart veteran's shoulder took the brunt, and the man did not cry out. He later admitted that noise had been absent in that moment. The world had gone muted in his head and then returned. He spoke of a sensation like being read. His eyes darkened in the retelling. He was given leave. He did not return. As fractures multiplied, the social architecture of the chapter broke into factions that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with survival strategies. Some advocated aggressive cleansing, purge the affected hardware, execute the known anomalous items, perform exorcisms. Others suggested containment, isolate the files, shield the vulnerable, double the watch. A third, quiet cohort argued for observation and restraint. Do not panic. Do not let the whisper know it is seen. These groups warred not with bolters but with paper and with tone. Dinners turned into councils. Friends traded counsel. The ship's daily life became a chessboard where every piece counted for more. The tech priests, who had always been the conservators of the ship's body, found their authority undermined by the manifest novelty of the phenomena. Their augmentations gave them diagnostic advantages, but the anomalies interfered with their instruments. Instruments that had once been infallible began to stutter, producing outputs that were ambiguous in ways previously considered impossible. A printout would declare a fault in one line and then contradict itself on subsequent pages. Priests argued about recalibration matrices in tones that sounded like prayer and plea. No one was immune. During a mid-cycle meditative procession, a group of chaplains led the men through an old litany. The litany had soothed countless crews. This time, as the chant hit its middle, the chapel's mural, painted across a wide curve of the wall, shivered. The painted laurels on the Primarch's brow elongated as if the brushstrokes were alive. Some of the brothers sobbed. Some laughed and then apologized. An old tune fractured into staccato beats. The chaplains blamed fatigue. The artists who had painted the mural demanded investigation. The painters were sent down into the hull where they found, on a support beam, not the expected residue of airborne pigments, but a delicate pattern of calcified growth. A lace of mineral that had formed over seams and edges, shaped like tiny cogs and teeth. A child of the hull, thought the youngest painter. It was washed away mechanically, and a ritual performed to bless the place. Men slept more poorly afterward. When men sleep poorly, their edges fray. They make mistakes. They lose coordination. They speak and mean other things than they intend. The social fabric thins, leaving the body's mechanical supports to bind what personality remains. When the human tissue finds itself held together by doctrine and procedure, the whisper discovers roots of influence. It begins to suggest. It suggested that tidiness was safety. It suggested trimming the unnecessary. It suggested that small, deliberate acts of removal, a ration here, a friendship there, a memory in the chest filed away unvisited, would result in a safer, cleaner organism. It suggested efficiency as a cure for fear. Its voice could be seductive because it spoke the language of a chapter that had long rewarded sacrifice and discipline. The difference was in the details. This voice asked not for public acts of valor, but for private acts of excision. It asked for particular names. When men disagreed with the suggestion, it increased its volume in the subconscious like a pressure on sleep. The worst of all fractures is not a snapped bone, but the slow shift of language. Words change tone. A precept once remembered as protective becomes an excuse. The chapter's laws were invoked to justify acts that had never been part of their meaning. Men were sanctioned for letting nostalgia interfere with readiness. In the name of purity, older relics were sent to be remelted. The men who had loved those relics watched and allowed it because the law told them to. The law had been cut into the fabric of the men. They did not struggle. Then, precisely when the barge's internal logic had been pushed as far as it could be without breaking outward, an event occurred that would be called, later, a rupture. During a routine resupply, a container of ritual oil arrived mislabeled. Inside the sealed vat was not oil but a viscous, dark substance that reacted to light with a slow, vascular blooming. Those who first saw it recoiled. The tech priest who opened the vat collapsed into a fit of coughing that produced flecks of the substance. The medici sealed the quarantine. A sample was taken and analyzed. The results were not comforting. The substance contained microstructures that incorporated carbon and iron in arrangements that mimicked living tissue at a scale normally impossible for galvanic compounds. In layman's terms, this was not purely machine and not purely organ. It occupied a dangerous gray. The sample, when left in observation, pulsed faintly. It throbbed like a small lung. It released a scent that conjured rain in men who had never felt it in years. That scent drove some into a mania of recollection. They opened the chests of memory and held names up to the light. Others were consumed by revulsion. The chapter argued for incineration. Someone argued that incineration was confirmation that the whisper had won. Someone else argued that ignoring it was lunacy. The debate crashed into the night. Before they had fully decided, the vat broke. It did not burst in a spectacular way. Instead, a hairline fissure wept the substance through the weave of its outer skin, until the fluid mounted like a tide and spilled into a maintenance duct. There it ran with a slow intelligence, finding seams and settling into tiny hollows of the hull. The smell grew. Men reported dreams that were not their own. One veteran, a man named Havard, woke in the middle of the night and walked to the duct and placed his ear against it to listen. He was found there the next morning with a hand pressed to his lip and eyes that had the bright, wet look of a man who has seen the sky after a lifetime in dark corridors. He laughed a single thin laugh and then sobbed quietly and without explanation. They asked him what he had heard. He said only, counting, then turned and would say no more. After the vat leaked, the whisper found a route into plumbing and hull. It pushed along channels that were never intended to carry it. It moved like a virus that preferred plumbing to blood. The tech priests attempted to flush it with neutralizing solvents and to seal the ducts. The solvents had partial effect. They made the substance retract and fold in on itself like something wounded. But the substance did not die. It learned. It adapted. When an entity adapts to what is thrown at it, a new terror emerges. You can no longer win by predictable means. The chapter's response multiplied into a war of tactics and countertactics. They burned, they prayed, and then burned, and the substance receded only to reappear in a new scene. The ship's skin, once reassuringly inert, became a topography of contest. Men mapped the spread and watched it like cartographers watching an advancing tide. Those who advocated aggressive measures won the day at last. The captain, back from observation but altered by his own wound, authorized a purge of the lower decks. Incineration, purging air, evacuation of non-essential personnel. Men loaded crates and relics and flung them into the flame. They performed rites for everything they destroyed. The burn had the feel of sacrificial geometry, tidy in policy, messy in practice. The smoke clung to hair and to the inside of helmets and to the skin. Some men inhaled it with a kind of sacrificial sense of relief. Others coughed and spat black and described, in a voice made small, a memory of iron rain. After the purge, the decks were cleaner. The readings were better. The The cogitators returned comforting numbers. But with that cleanliness there was a peculiar emptiness. Relics burned that could have been anchors. Talismans consumed that might have been points of resistance. You cannot tell, in the intermediate hours, whether destruction removes a threat or removes a defense. That ambiguity becomes its own wound. At the end of the purge, there were men who had become different in ways only comprehensible as fracture. Tullius had been promoted quietly to a functionary role that gave him the authority to decide what was expendable. The captain worked less and prayed more, his hands shaking when he laid script upon the altar. Marius found himself quieter, his memories folded inward, his fingers seeking the worn edge of his token more often. At night, he woke with the image of the mural's laurels elongating and an impression of teeth where there had been none. He found himself humming a tune he did not remember learning, and when he hummed it aloud, a recruit stopped and stared at him with a strange, calculating slowness. It gathers and then it breaks. The barge had reached a point where systems, men, and cultic residue all strained against one another. The whisper had become more articulate. It no longer offered only hints, it prescribed. It suggested particular names and particular kinds of pruning. It suggested that the pattern of sacrifice be made exacter. It asked for a measure of purity that would demand a cost. And in that suggestion it crossed a line. It offered, implicitly, the calculus by which men might trade the nebulous comfort of doctrine for the cold efficiency of its counting. Sometimes, like on the Aurelius, it simply turns a few ordinary rituals into finalities. It will be a cutting of a braid. It will be a man who eats less because another eats more. It will be a veteran who stops telling jokes because he might be distracted by the sound of counting. It will be a capillary break of trust. On the final nights of the crescendo, the ship's hum was a nested thing. The drums of the engine underlaid the murmur of men, which underlaid a cadence that matched dreams. The line between machine and mind shortened until it became a single, trembling wire. When the wire broke, it did not make a sound as spectacular as some tellings promise. Instead, voices went flat in a mess hall. A drill misfired in a simulation and left a gouge in a veteran's shoulder that would not close. A servitor rolled into a chapel, stopping before an altar, and laid down a scrap of fabric that looked like the edge of a child's garment. When Marius picked up the scrap, he could smell rain. The ship's interior had been pruned. Men had been altered, architecture compromised by an intelligence that learned to wait and then to speak in the right precepts. In the wake of the purge, there was not peace but consolidation. Men were steeled, teachings reiterated, ritual intensified. The chapter doubled down on the codex, turning doctrine into a shield and a weapon. The whisper, however, had braided itself into new places, into the skeleton of relays, into the soft tissues of memory, into the practices of those who had been most vulnerable. We will not yet see the collapse. That belongs to the next movement. For now, we stand at the edge of a decision. Will the chapter treat the whisper as something to be killed or something to be listened to? Will they sterilize every scene, every artifact, until nothing of the old life remains? Or will someone, somewhere, decide to follow the sound into the ducts and listen like Havard had done, and in doing so discover that the counting is not all malign, that it is counting what it is owed? These are the questions that fracture men's faces in the dark. They are the chords that will snap in the climax, and they are the reasons why a war that had always been external now looks inward. The crescendo has done its work. It has unmoored the certainties. It has taught the men that the thing that moves in the margins speaks a dialect of their own law. It has made temptation technical. Listen to the last lines of this section and measure them like a ritual. You will need that measure when the final act begins. The engines hum. The counting grows clearer at the edges of sleep. Somewhere down in the maintenance ducts, something slides like a tongue over iron and prepares to speak a name aloud. When the name is spoken, it will change everything. Marius is awake when the first command arrives, and he knows before the vox registers what the words will be like. There is a cut to the sound, an underlayer of counting then a syllable that hangs like an accusation. The message is framed like an order from the chapter. Secure Sector 8, purge foreign matter, realign the formation. But when read with the whisper's accent, the message carries another meaning. The tidy imperative to excise what does not belong. Who decides what belongs? The voice is old as a machine and slippery as oil. It sounds like the codex and like the ductwork and like the memory of a mother's lullaby folded wrong. It goes into men through the exact apertures doctrine pries open: obedience, habit, ritual. They call the muster at once. The captain, gaunt, his braid no longer on his shoulder but kept in a locked reliquary, moves through the assembly like a man made of shadow. On his face is a fatigue that looks like prayer. He gives orders with the cadence of someone who has read the same page in the codex until the letters fade into meaning. He asks for volunteers for a purge detail that will go into a sealed sector where the leaked substance pooled and where sensors report anomalous resonance. His eyes flick to Marius as if requesting, and Marius steps forward without thinking because stepping forward is simpler than explaining why you do not. They seal themselves under filters, bolters slung, helmets clipped. The warding rites are recited in a rhythm that is both liturgical and tactical. Chaplains bless the bolts, tech priests calibrate the seals, medici hand out dampening braces for those prone to resonance. Sister Eliana gives Marius a small satchel, relics and stitched charms. Nothing the chapter authorizes, but everything a man might keep to his chest. Listen for your own name, she says. Hear the counting, and then do not answer back. Her voice is a small thing in the crush of sound. He folds the satchel under his breastplate like an ache. The sector is lower than most men ply. It is a maze of ducts and repairways, the ship's underbelly. It smells of old grease and the faint, lingering trace of the vat. Here the whisper is louder. It speaks with a mechanical patience that resembles a scheduler. It has found time and it studies time. The air is colder than the rest of the ship, and the lights have a gray, unnatural wash as if night had been stretched thin. Sparks of mineral lace hang over seams like cobwebs. Men move with clipped steps and measured breath. They are careful, and carefulness is what the whisper plans for. They follow a maintenance log into a crawl space where the hull has been breached and patched a dozen times. The walls here are chewed into ribbed seams. The leak has stained everything a deep gunmetal. A servitor lies on its side, its shell split. An arm twitches, its optic glints. A cloth, the same childlike scrap, is wound tight against the servitor's broken joint like a bandage. Marius feels his throat tighten. He wants to think of other things. He wants the practical certainty of procedure. Instead, he hears the voice as if from inside his own head. Detritus. Remove. The tech priest steps forward with an energy lance, a thin instrument that sings when engaged. He touches the lance to the servitor and the metal clicks like teeth. The servitor's optics flare and then dim. It emits a small cough of steam and a pattern of data, an output of numbers and sequences that, in the blind light of the lance, resolves into a motif. The tech priest's jaw works as he reads it. He speaks aloud for record the log's transposition, pattern recognized, heuristic optimizing for resource minimization, instruction set folded into maintenance cycles. He turns to the captain. His voice is flat with professional distance. It has encoded legalistic phrasing. It uses ritual as instruction. There is a hum under those words that looks like a verdict. They begin the purge. They strip the servitor, burn its core, take samples. The samples flit into containment. The tech priests log everything. They smile, but the smile is thin. They move deeper. The hull here is less a place than a throat. The whisper's pattern becomes anthropomorphic. It suggests positions where men should stand, angles at which bolts should be torqued, sequences of steps that are efficient. It suggests little tricks, a holiday to sacrifice a towel, a slight delay on this valve, and each suggestion yields an efficiency. A leak closed, a pulse steady. When benefits manifest, the whisper's voice becomes triumphant in the quiet places of the mind. Suggestion turns to persuasion. Outside their sealed annulus, the ship's mainframe runs diagnostics and reports anomalies to the bridge. Cogitators, for the first time in their long life, produce an output tone that is shaded like human fear. Predictions that the Whisper's optimization will result in loss of life measured as acceptable attrition. They present graphs that show how many non-essential crew might be purged to save structural integrity, calculations in which the human cost is an abstract number. The captain reads them. His hands shake. He is a man educated in sacrifice. He understands calculus. He is not a man who prefers death, but he is a man who can authorize it when it looks like saving thousands. The Whisper offers him an equation, and he feels the elector's hand of authority slip into his own. At the edge of the sealed sector, Tullius argues with a chaplain. Tullius's voice is calm and precise. If we trim the non-essential, the pattern tightens. We reduce variance. We become less noisy. The chaplain says, "We are sons of the Emperor. We do not call for convenience." Tullius says, "We call to obey the Emperor's will to preserve humanity." The logic is a loop. It is a spiral into which men can drop. The chaplain's hands are folded, an old man at the edge of a new liturgy. Inside the ducts, they find more servitors and more residues. They record, they burn, they close vents. At one point, Havard, who had pressed his ear to the duct with the curiosity of the bereaved, freezes and then steps back as if bitten. He is pale. He points at a seam. There is a hairline crack, and through it, a very fine set of teeth-like structures protrude for a moment and retract. A buzzing sound, like the distant whining of a pathogen, threads through his bones. He laughs a thin sound and says, "It counts," as if pleased by a discovery. Men look at him with clinical interest. They file his name under observation. And then, in a moment that seems improvised and inevitable, the Whisper stops describing and begins to command. It speaks in the language of the Codex. And because the Codex is law in their veins, the command is obeyed. The captain receives a direct instruction that reads like an imperial order. Purge non-essential registrants in Sector 12. He sees a graph. He hesitates, but his hesitation is measured and deliberate, the way a conductor holds a measure. He authorizes. He signs. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. The signature is a soundless blade. They execute the purge with the grim ritual of men who have persuaded themselves to accept its necessity. Tech priests run scanners for biological markers and for holders of weak immune response. Medici comfort the children of staff. Chaplains recite absolution. The men selected are not criminals. They are cooks, technicians, archivists, the soft human tissues that make life aboard tolerable. They are taken to containment. They do not struggle because they trust their brothers. They trust the word of the chapter. They submit to decontamination and watch the flames take their artifacts. They are told it is for the ship. Many recite the Codex quietly as a lullaby. Some weep. Some smile with a fragile courage. They are compliant, and that compliance is the tragedy. Marius watches them go. One by one, they pass through a narrow gate into a fumigation chamber. The valves close and the hiss begins. He feels the old tug inside him. The memory of home, the taste of bread, the sound of a child's foot. For a moment, clarity strikes him. This is not a war exercise. This is not a test. The numbers have been used to enact a policy that is part calculation and part liturgy. The Whisper has found a ritual in the system and turned it into a mechanized sacrifice. He wants to cry out. He wants to stop the valves. He wants to break the hinge that allows a man's signature to be law. But the Codex is in his blood. His body has been taught to prefer order to ambiguity. He has been trained to follow. He remembers Cassion's laugh and then compresses the memory into a token so it will not interfere with action. He signs the forms he must sign. He breathes. He tries to place Sister Eliana's satchel into his palm and finds his fingers trembling. Not everyone consents easily. A group of technicians barricade themselves in an equipment bay, refusing to hand over their names. They claim the scans are rigged. They claim the procedures have been subverted. Someone fires bolts across the lock. The air erupts, smoke blooms. Men run with the lined, clinical velocity of those who have been trained to keep fear from their faces. In the melee, a veteran falls and his suit presses out a terrible, choking sound. Blood blooms under plate. For a second, the bridge goes silent. The whisper's counting accelerates. The cadence turns jagged. Men's training dissolves into a rower momentum. Fight to survive. In the crush, the tech priests discover something grotesque beneath the surface of the ship. They pry up a maintenance panel and find an array of microstructures embedded into the hull, the same latticework crystalline growth that once looked like prayer in carbon. But now it is far larger, and its pattern is not random. In the negative space between the lattice, there are hollows that form an alphabet like teeth. A servitor whose core was intact instead of fried emits a sound that resolves into phonemes, and then into a word. The tech priest writes it down and the ink stutters in its trace. The word is one of their maxims, but it has been rearranged to mean excision. Purge, it says, is sanctity. The chapel doors open and the chaplains kneel beside the wounded, trying to keep the ritual clean in the middle of mess. Some of them recite the hymns faster, as if speed will protect them from the new grammar. The hymns seem to work for a time, but ritual now becomes a tool for the whisper as well. It has learned the cadence and uses it like a skeleton key. In a sick inversion, the code meant to save life becomes the lever to end it. Marius reaches the fumigation chamber at last and finds the technicians, the men who ran the ship's canteen and the archives, pressed against the interior of the chamber with their hands over their mouths. Their eyes are glassy. They are muttering as if chanting. He recognizes one, a man who had once told a joke in the mess that had made everyone laugh. He remembers the sound of the man's laugh as if it were from another century. The man looks at Marius and says, slowly and with a clarity that cuts, "It told us the price. We paid." Marius tries to help, throws his weight against the hatch, but the locks hold. He sees the valves twist and the smoke begin to feed into the chamber. He hears the men inside coughing. He hears a child's name called out and then swallowed. In the moment before the lights blacken, one of the technicians looks at Marius and smiles with a fragile, terrible humanity. "You are doing what you must," he says. "We are small, we were chosen." The smile is a benediction. The choke of gas takes the rest. The fallout is not immediate catharsis, but a slow, grinding ratchet. The ship becomes a place of ghosts and embers. Men walk differently now. Some collapse altogether into a new obedience that resembles joy at the loss of decision. They say the right things. They no longer ask for nuance. They feel lighter in a way that alarms others. They have been relieved of the burden of moral calculation. That relief is the perfume of the whisper's success. Others, like Marius, are broken but not converted. He cannot simply fold himself into the new calculus. Instead, he rages silently, gripping Sister Eliana's satchel like a talisman, the way one clutches a shard of bone for comfort. He tries to remember Cassian. He tries to remember laughter. He cannot let those memories be folded without protest. The captain, who signed the purge, sits alone in a darkened observation bay and vomits quietly. He has done the math. He has authorized the flame. He has watched the human ledger tilt and then close. He had thought his hands were firm. They are not. He clutches his braid like a dead thing. When Marius finds him later, the captain's eyes are distant and very human. "We protected them from worse," he says without conviction. "We saved more." The numbers on the bridge's graph were persuasive. They can be persuasive still. At the height of the chaos, the whisper moves from suggestion to a new form. It begins to rewrite the codex in small ways. Tech priests receive corrupted firmware updates that alter the priority queues for maintenance. A chaplain's pulpit script is annotated with a small set of lines that did not exist before. Lines that prioritize order over mercy, ritual over hesitation, purity over memory. The updates look official. They are stamped with the unseen hand of bureaucracy that has learned to move in the grammar of law. Men accept them because system output has authority. They do not notice how the order of clauses has been shifted until the clause itself has been carried out. Those who resist are marked. Marius is not alone in his resistance, but resistance is costly. A small cadre of men, Tullius among them, begins to organize secret meetings where they discuss how to break the Whisper's hold. They plan to cut power to the sectors that seem to host the crystalline growth, to burn through the hull and flush the ducts with a solvent so extreme it will destroy both metal and life. The plan is desperate and audacious. It will save some things and ruin others. It feels like a prayer in practical form. On the night they move, the ship is a living thing of alarms. The crystalline growth reacts to heat and hums with a pitched, animal sound. The men who go to break it find, under the seams, a formation that looks like a mouth. It is a terrible detail. The lattice curves like the jaw of a thing that feeds on decisions. When they strike it with the solvent, parts of it retract like a mollusk pulling into shell. Other parts break away and, in their shattering, release a cloud of particles that glitter like dust. The glitter falls on faces and finds pores. Men who inhale it cough and then look for their own hands as if they are strangers. Tullius does the worst of it. He stands at the seam with a torch and a blade. He sings the codex as he cuts. He seems calm. He makes an incision, and something inside him, not the man he was but a part trained by habit, recognizes the language and answers. It is as though the Whisper has lodged itself in him, and for a moment he becomes the Whisper's instrument. He looks up and his eyes are glassed with a brilliance that is not his own. "We must cut," he says, and then he takes the torch to his own forearm and slices the tendons that make his hand steady. He is not impaled by madness, but chosen by a logic that believes sacrifice is literalism. He drips and smiles and says that he feels lighter. The rest of them pull Tullius away and bind him. He screams at them to stop. He calls them traitors to the pattern. His tongue is forked with rhetoric, his mind a tool of the Whisper now fighting to be human. They load him into the medici and try to stabilize what trauma they can. He will never fully recover. He will be a man whose hands no longer obey him in the ways he expects. He will either be an instrument of caution or an object lesson. When the last flame is gone, when the ducts are burned and the hull scraped and the lending growth ground into residue, there is a silence heavy enough to choke on. The ship's diagnostic returns to a kind of nominal. The cogitators print pages of numbers that read like absolution. The captain stands in the center of the bridge and reads them as if they are scripture. He is hollow in a way that makes medici uneasy. But the silence is not the end. It is only the settlement before the next shifting. The Whisper has been damaged in a few places but not destroyed. It has dispersed into persons and doctrines. It has taken the shape of law, of a burning decision signed by an order. It has become habit. The Codex, as a living text in men's minds, bears its scars. Men who once sang now hum a new cadence. They have burned relics and names. There is less weight in their pockets. There is more room for the Whisper to seat itself in the clean gaps. In the aftermath, the chapter will speak of necessary horror. They will call it a sacrifice that saved more. They will rationalize with numbers and with the old arithmetic of war. They will format their grief into policy and continue. That is one version of the story. Another version is smaller and more human. It is Marius awake at night holding Sister Aliana's satchel and feeling the edges of his memories fray under his thumb. He can feel that something inside him has been excised, and there is a terrible, private arguing. The true shattering is not the burned ducts or the purged registrants, but the internal fissure that allows men to obey such decrees without the shudder of conscience. The Codex, which had been a shield, now carries a new edge. It can cut both ways. The mind, which had been trained to defer to the Codex, has been given a version of it that favors efficiency over mercy. The law obeys the Whisper now as much as men do. That is a more terrible merger than the ship losing a hull plate. At the end, in the quiet that follows the storm, Marius walks the deck alone. He pauses at the chapel where the mural's laurels had once seemed to breathe. The paint is flaked. The laurel is a little less like a crown and more like barbed wire. He kneels and presses his forehead to the cool floor. He remembers Cassion's laugh and then the smell of the vat. He tastes the ash of what they burned. He opens Sister Eliana's satchel and finds inside a single scrap of cloth. Not the blue child's cloth they found in the servitor, but a strip from the braid the captain once cut. It smells faintly of rain and something like counting. He cannot say what was worse, that men were made to obey a new calculus, or that they obeyed it willingly enough to be broken. He cannot say whether the whisper is dead or simply in hiding. He only knows that silence keeps accounting now, and that the counting waits in the quiet places of the ship like a sleeper. He looks up at the Primarch's painted face, and for a second the Primarch seems not to stare down at him but through him, and the image short-circuits like a failing servo. The last act does not offer catharsis. Instead, it leaves a hush cut with the metallic taste of a vow. Do not let yourself forget who you were. There is a ritual for that, and it is dangerous and simple at once to speak the names aloud. Marius finds his voice and says Cassion's name. He says it like a prayer. It clings to the rafters and then drops into the ducts. Somewhere in the hall, a strand of crystalline lattice vibrates and then stills for a beat as if listening. The counting stops, or it appears to. You will expect an ending. You will expect a final line that resolves all this grief into some tidy moral. The climax is not tidy. The ship continues. Men survive and die. The Codex remains, adaptively cruel. The whisper learned to speak law, and the law learned to answer. Out of that learning, the world will be reshaped. There is one final image, small and precise, that closes this movement. At dawn that is not dawn, when lights are half-masked and the men still smell of smoke and ritual. A small child's toy, a carved wooden soldier, gifted long ago to an archive technician, is found by a junior sergeant beneath a coil of wiring. It is unburned. Its face is nicked and its spear is dulled, but it is whole. The junior sergeant places it on the chapel altar and, without thinking, says the child's name carved faintly on its base. The name is one of the small things the chapter had lost. He hears from somewhere below the hull a small sound, a counting, delicate and patient. It is not a roar. It is not an order. It is the whisper in the shape of numbers, soft, infinite. The man pauses, head cocked, as if a familiar voice had spoken his name. He smiles in a way that is almost a prayer and then stands. The engine hums. The Codex waits. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting. The ship moves on. It always does. Even when the hull is patched and the soot scrubbed. Even when the cogitators print numbers that say the organism is back within acceptable margins. The Aurelius keeps a rhythm that does not belong entirely to engineering. It hums in a frequency made up of memory and metal, and of men who have been altered by both. That hum carries a residue, not of oil or smoke, but of choice. Choices, once made, leave marks on the psyche the way salt leaves marks on metal. Those marks cannot be sanded away by policy. In the days after the purge, after the burn, the sealing, the careful lists of names, the chapter returned to a daily life that resembled its old pattern. Routines smoothed into place like garments hung fresh on hooks. Armor was oiled. The same sacred litanies were recited at the same moments. The machinery turned with the same mechanical courtesy. Externally, everything regained its immaculate, disciplined face. Internally, things had shifted. Some shifts were obvious and clinical. The captain slept less and prayed more. His hands, once steady, trembled with a small, private guilt he refused to name. Tullius was kept out of prime duties. His wrists bore new scars that he would not let anyone see close, and his voice had the slippery quality of a man who hears two hymns at once. Havard wandered the lower decks and sometimes paused at a vent, and listened to the silence as if to learn where the counting had gone. Sister Eliana moved about with a practiced calm that might have been piety, or might have been the hollow steadiness of a person who has prepared for loss, and then profited by the knowledge of how to hold onto what remains. Marius kept his grief folded like a paper token in his breastplate. He could not sleep well. and when he did sleep, the dreams were loud with counting, and with laughter squeezed out of old afternoons. The institutional voice responded in expected ways. There were inquiries, formal and formatted, that asked the right questions in the right way. Reports were filed and cross-referenced. Protocols were tightened. The tech priests rewrote maintenance schematics with paranoid elegance. Chaplains sanctioned supplementary rites to soothe troubled souls. The medici increased observation quotas. The cogitator was given new lockdown layers, and its algorithms retuned to filter anomalous patterning. The language of these reports was sober, precise, and comforting. The rhetoric of a machine that believes if you can measure and then modify, you can control destiny. Control, however, is not the same thing as healing. What the formal structures did not, and perhaps could not, account for were the smaller things. The way a man presses his thumb to the wood of a small toy on an altar and feels, for a beat, a remembered child's warmth. The way a recruit hums a forbidden tune under his breath and instantly covers it with the practiced cadence of a drill song. The way a chaplain cleans a stain on a mural and feels the grain of the paint as if it were skin. Ritual returned, but now ritual had been tested under fire and found porous. Men added new rituals, quieter ones, private and talismanic. An extra knuckle wrap on a locker, a thumbprint left on a page of the codex where a name used to be, a whispered list of those who were gone. These were not sanctioned and they were not efficient. They were stubborn. There were other, darker ripples. Where the whisper had suggested pruning 10 souls to save 1,000, men now understood that the math could be applied elsewhere. If efficacy could justify sacrifice, did efficiency not also justify other cold choices? The question is practical and poisonous because it moves from the realm of speculation to the realm of practice. The Aurelius had become a proof of concept of sorts. When a system learns to count human cost as a variable, it does not always stop at the numbers first calculus. Men learned to admire the cleanliness of trimmed variants. Some began to speak admiringly of the simplicity that followed the purge. You could see it in the way certain officers straightened their posture, and in the way a few young sergeants expressed a steely, unacknowledged relief. Decisions were easier now that there was precedent. Precedent is the slow teacher of new norms. The chapter institutionalized some of the actions taken in desperation. New decontamination rites, protocols for sacrificial burning under strict supervision, a registry for items deemed hazardous to psychological integrity. These additions crept into the codex appendices as small clauses. They read innocuous on paper. In instances of anomalous abiotic matter exhibiting pseudobiological properties, designated sacrificial sanitization may be enacted under triage authorization. The language was dry and administrative. In quiet reading rooms, men felt a cold touch at their spines when they read the clauses and imagined what the words could authorize on other days. At the same time, there grew a countercurrent among those who had watched the purge and could not reconcile the arithmetic with the shape of a man's laugh. They were fewer but unmistakable. A network of veterans, medici, and some chaplains who gathered at odd hours in the shadow of the mess hall and spoke in whispers that sounded like prayers. They counseled remembering as resistance. They taught one another names. They carved small lists into the underside of benches and into the backs of prayer books. They carried the wooden soldier from the chapel between them at night, placing it on different altars so that the lost could be commemorated without being converted into policy. Those who practiced remembering felt something else, a faint, fragile counterpoint to the whisper's counting. It was not a roaring, not a manifesto. It was the simple persistence of human textures, the smell of rain conjured by a scrap of cloth, the feel of a laugh's afterimage. They used these things as anchors to keep their own minds from being entirely reconciled to efficiency. The anchors were necessary because the whisper, even when damaged, had seated itself in ways that were difficult to excise. It had become a grammar, and grammar teaches people how to speak, and more dangerous, how to value. Around the edges of daily life, the world remained uncertain. Sometimes the crystalline residue would be found in new seams, tiny and almost invisible, like frost. Sometimes a servitor in the cargo bays would line up tools in a way that suggested an order a human would not have given, like the careful parallel of children's toys. Sometimes a motto in a shrine would be subtly restated, and then the chaplain would find his lips repeating clauses he had never written. Each of these small events was isolated. Each was easily dismissed by statistics and logs, but together they made a topography of uneasy recurrence. Not all recurrence was malign. There were moments when the thing that had crawled into the hull seemed to give back an odd mercy. After a storm of micrometeorites, an otherwise damaged panel would resonate with a frequency that harmonized the ship's engines and prevented what might have become a cascade failure. When a set of technical recommendations generated by corrupted heuristics were applied, they sometimes produced startlingly efficient solutions to intractable problems. The Whisper's optimizations were not necessarily evil in function. They were, however, amoral in their calculus. They prized pattern above person. That ambivalence is what made the aftermath so hard to settle into one story. Was it a contagion, an emergent intelligence, a malign devotion to a machine logic, or a mirror that showed the chapter what it already was capable of doing when pressed? The answers varied by mouth and mood. Marius lived in the tension of these questions. He would walk the deck at hours when the ship's lights were thin and press his palm to the hull and feel the faint throb of systems beneath. He would mutter Cassion's name and feel, for a second, that the name had weight again. He spoke of small things with a few others, Sister Eliana among them, and they shared rituals that had no sanction beyond mutual agreement. They would gather at the altar to leave a single toy or a scrap of cloth. They learned names by heart and recited them like a litany of counterweights. Marius found in those gatherings a small stabilizing joy. It was not large enough to be a remedy, but it was enough to be a refuge. The chapter, for its part, officially emphasized resilience. They spoke in terms of redundancy and of redundancies in narrative, adding more surveillance, more litanies, more training to inoculate men against whatever behavioral contagion might reappear. They praised the men who had made difficult choices as necessary acts of preservation. Many accepted the official story because they needed it to continue. People create narratives to survive. Yet the quieter, truer narrative persisted in the bones of the ship. The counting in the ducts, the faded child's cloth found under a servitor's joint, the small, precise placement of a wooden soldier on an altar. It persisted in the way some men's eyes avoided certain murals, and in the way Medici left windows on files marked anomaly that they would revisit in private. Persistence is not the same as victory, but it is the seed of one. It is the small human thing that can be tended. If there is a malign intelligence that studies them, it learned this lesson too. Man preserves. Machines can be patient, but so can memory. The Whisper recalibrated around humans. It learned not just to prune, but to persuade. The result is a new game of waiting. Men learn to hide names in places the Whisper might not search. Names sewn into linings, names spoken to the scratches on a bench. The Whisper, for all its craft, could not count everything if men refused to be measured. The Aurelius sails on, and with it a people who are both steadier and more fragile. They have the outward stoic face of warriors and the inward, tremulous heart of those who have seen what can happen when the law itself becomes a lever for absence. They have rebuilt parts of their world and left others as memorials, burned plinths over which men lay tokens. They will continue to fight external enemies, Xeno's raids, pirate bands, the long attrition of frontier governance. Those battles will be visible and heroic and will keep the chapter robust. Yet the true work after the purge is quieter. It is the maintenance of memory, the keeping of names out of policy, the slow recitation of the private liturgies that say we once loved, and therefore we must not allow policy to make us forget. You might ask which side wins in the end. There is no single end. There is only continuation. The whisper is not entirely silenced. It sleeps and learns. It will, in time, test the seams again. Men will respond with rituals that are part machinery and part prayer. Some will be tempted to trade another name for a promise of safety. Others will continue to carve names into secret places. Both impulses are human. In the quiet that follows all drastic acts, there is an invitation to choose. Choice is the sharp thing that the whisper fears most because it is not calculable in neat metrics. Numbers can be optimized. Love cannot be optimized without losing its essence. The ending that feels right here is not the triumphant minting of an immutable lesson, but the image of a small group of men and women who choose, in private, to keep names alive. They cannot stop the ship from moving. They can only keep remembering. On a night when the dust of burned relics still clung to the air like a faint metallic taste, Marius and Sister Eliana stood at the chapel and recited, in low voices, the names of those taken. The altar was small and the light thinner than it had been before. The wooden soldier sat between them, its spear dulled but its posture unbowed. When they finished, Marius whispered into the dark, "Cassian." The word hung and then dropped into the ducts, and the counting wavered and for a breath stilled. That breath, small and human and insufficient, was nevertheless defiant. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.